Hey guys, tonight we step softly across the cold stone floor of a medieval infirmary, where the air smells faintly of rosemary, smoke, and something you probably don't want to identify. A narrow window lets in a ribbon of grey light. Somewhere in the corner, a bowl wriggles suspiciously. You're not entirely sure if you're here for a mild headache or your inevitable doom, but either way, you probably won't survive this. At least not with your dignity intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling me your location and local time. I love seeing where in the world you're drifting off from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You sit on a wooden bench that creaks under even your most polite movements. Across from you, a man in a long robe squints at a parchment covered in looping Latin. He's your doctor, or at least the closest thing the 14th century has to one. His sleeves are rolled up, revealing forearms that look less like they belong to a healer and more like someone who wrestles livestock for sport. The bowl in the corner, it's full of leeches. In medieval Europe, leeches were a mainstream medical tool. Bloodletting was not fringe, not weird, not alternative. It was respected science, backed by centuries of tradition going all the way to ancient authorities like Galen. If you feel faint, feverish, or simply unlucky, the logic is simple. Something inside you is out of balance. The solution? Remove some blood, preferably a lot. You try to look calm as the doctor reaches into the bowl. The leeches stretch lazily between his fingers, like overcooked noodles with ambition. They're about to become very invested in your personal wellness journey. The medieval waiting room is less a place of quiet magazines and more a chamber of groans. A man nearby clutches his arm, wrapped in cloth that has clearly seen better centuries. A child coughs wetly into her mother's apron. No one seems particularly reassured, but everyone believes this is the best available option. Because at this point in history, medicine isn't about germs or bacteria. Those concepts don't even exist yet. It's about balance, about invisible forces, about restoring harmony inside a body that is thought to behave like a moody ecosystem. Historians still argue whether medieval doctors truly believed all their treatments worked, or whether some quietly suspected the limits of their knowledge but had nothing better to offer. After all, when you live in a world without microscopes, without anesthesia, without antibiotics, your imagination fills in the gaps. The leech is placed carefully on your forearm. It latches. You try not to think about it. Bloodletting was prescribed for everything from fevers to headaches to heartbreak. There are records of physicians recommending specific veins for specific ailments. If your head hurts, perhaps the vein in your forehead is the culprit. If your stomach churns, maybe your ankle vein needs attention. It's all very logical in a way that feels soothing, until you remember that losing too much blood can make you dramatically worse. And yet, people often reported feeling better afterward. Not necessarily because the disease was cured, but because removing blood can temporarily lower blood pressure and create a sense of lightness. Also, if you survive the procedure, there's a certain psychological comfort in believing something decisive has been done. Action feels like healing, even when it isn't. In some monasteries, leeches were carefully bred and stored like precious medical equipment. Monks, who were among the more educated members of society, copied medical text by hand and tended herb gardens designed to support these treatments. Picture neat rows of sage, thyme and lavender swaying gently in the breeze, while inside someone is being enthusiastically drained for their own good. There's also a quirky tidbit that might make you glance at your arm. Leeches were sometimes reused. Yes, reused. A well-fed leech would be coaxed into releasing its meal, occasionally with a sprinkle of salt and then saved for another patient. Efficient? Perhaps. Hygienic? Let's not ruin the mood. You notice the doctor studying your face, checking for signs of improvement. He asks how you feel. You say lighter, which is technically true in several measurable ways. He nods, satisfied. The theory holds. Balance is being restored. Somewhere in the cosmic ledger of your body, a column labelled excess is being trimmed. Outside, a cart rattles over cobblestones. Life continues. Markets bustle. Blacksmiths hammer away. And here you are, voluntarily hosting a small aquatic parasite because centuries of respected scholarship insist it's wise. The fascinating thing is that medieval medicine isn't foolish in the way we often imagine. It's systematic, it's structured, It has textbooks and universities and learned debates conducted in Latin. The problem isn't a lack of intelligence, it's a lack of tools and foundational knowledge. Without understanding circulation, something that won't be clearly described until William Harvey in the 17th century, blood seems less like a constantly moving river and more like a reservoir that can overflow. The leech grows plump and satisfied. Eventually it drops off, having done its noble duty. The doctor presses a cloth to your skin and ties it snugly. He gives you instructions. Rest, avoid cold draughts, perhaps consume a light broth. You stand carefully. The room sways just a little, but that might be your imagination. Or your reduced blood volume. Hard to say. As you step back into the narrow street, you feel oddly calm. The treatment was unpleasant, yes, but purposeful. There is comfort in ritual. Comfort in believing that someone, somewhere, understands the hidden mechanics of your suffering. Behind you, in that dim stone room, another patient takes your place on the bench. The bowl of leeches waits patiently, as it has for generations, ready to serve the grand theory of balance that governs medieval healing. And you, slightly woozy but strangely reassured, begin to realise that this is only the beginning of your journey through a world where medicine often means doing something dramatic, even when doing less might have saved you. You don't get far down the cobbled street before your medieval doctor calls you back inside. Not because the leech session went poorly, no, that was textbook, but because you still look, in his professional opinion, imbalanced. And imbalance, as you're about to learn, is the entire plot of your existence. You sit again, slightly paler than before, while he unrolls a parchment diagram of the human body. It looks less like anatomy, and more like a weather map drawn by someone who has never seen the inside of a person. 4 words dominate the page: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Welcome to the theory of the 4 humours. This idea, inherited from ancient Greek medicine and refined by the Roman physician Galen, absolutely rules medieval healthcare. The mainstream historical fact here is simple. For over 1,000 years in Europe and parts of the Islamic world, physicians believed health depended on maintaining balance among these 4 bodily fluids. Too much or too little of anyone and you're in trouble. You unfortunately are always in trouble. Blood is hot and wet, phlegm is cold and wet, yellow bile is hot and dry, black bile is cold and dry. If you're feeling energetic and cheerful, congratulations, you're sanguine, dominated by blood. If you're sluggish and sleepy, that's phlegmatic, irritable and fiery, choleric thanks to yellow bile. Sad and brooding? Melancholic, a word literally born from melina chole, meaning black bile. So when you told the doctor you felt a bit gloomy last week, he didn't hear rough day. He heard dangerous excess of cold, dry black bile threatening the harmony of the cosmos. Historians still argue whether medieval physicians interpreted the humours metaphorically or literally. Did they imagine black bile as a tangible substance sloshing around, or more as a conceptual force? Either way, treatments were very real, and often very unpleasant. Your diet becomes the first battlefield. Food is categorised by qualities: hot, cold, wet, dry. Lamb might be warming, cucumber might be cooling. If you have too much heat in your system, say a fever, you are prescribed cooling foods and drinks. Maybe lettuce, maybe diluted wine. If you're too cold and damp, hello phlegm, you'll need spices, onions, and possibly something aggressively peppery to ignite your internal furnace. You imagine your body as a medieval kitchen, with the doctor acting like a slightly dramatic chef. Ah yes, he murmurs, far too much moisture in this one. There's a strange logic to it. Without knowledge of bacteria or viruses, patterns still exist. People with fevers feel hot. People with colds feel congested. Observations become theories, and theories become doctrine. Entire medical schools are built on this framework. At places like the University of Paris, students memorize these principles as unquestionable truth. And it doesn't stop at food. Your personality is now a medical condition. If you're naturally cheerful and outgoing, that's a sanguine temperament. Too much blood. The solution? Perhaps reduce rich meats and avoid overstimulation. If you're prone to anger, clearly yellow bile is running the show. Better cool that down before you start dueling someone over spilled ale. There's even a quirky tidbit that might make you raise an eyebrow. Some physicians believed seasons affected your humours directly. Spring increases blood, summer boosts yellow bile, autumn stirs black bile, winter enhances phlegm. So if you feel especially gloomy in autumn, congratulations, You are cosmically predictable. You glance out the window. It is, inconveniently, autumn. The doctor nods as if the falling leaves personally conspired against you. Treatments escalate depending on severity. Dietary adjustments are gentle. Bloodletting, as you've experienced, is more assertive. There are also purgatives, herbal concoctions designed to make you vomit or, let's say, urgently reconsider your life choices in the privy. The idea is simple. Expel the excess humour. And yet sometimes patients survive. Sometimes they even improve. A lighter diet might genuinely help certain digestive issues. Resting after blood loss might force someone to slow down and recover from stress. Correlation becomes confirmation. The humoral theory is elegant because it explains everything. Too elegant, perhaps. If a treatment fails, the diagnosis wasn't wrong. The balance just wasn't fully restored. More leeches, stronger purgatives, stricter diet. You begin to see how medieval doctors, working within this system, could unintentionally make things worse. If you're already weak from illness and someone drains your blood or dehydrates you further, your body has fewer resources to fight whatever is actually wrong. But from their perspective, they are restoring harmony. There's also an almost poetic beauty to the system. The human body mirrors the universe. 4 elements, earth, air, fire, water, correspond to 4 humours. You're a tiny cosmos wobbling slightly out of alignment. The doctor is less a mechanic and more an astrologer, chemist, philosopher hybrid, trying to tune you like a lute. You feel a bit drowsy now, whether from earlier blood loss or the sheer weight of being cosmically damp. The doctor prescribes you a warming tonic, wine infused with cinnamon and ginger. It burns slightly going down, which he interprets as success. Heat combating cold, dryness balancing wetness. As you leave again, clutching your spiced wine, you can't help but admire the confidence of it all. No uncertainty, no, we're not sure. Just a grand unified theory of existence flowing through every diagnosis. And yet, somewhere in the back of your mind, perhaps in a small pocket of rebellious black bile, you wonder what happens when the theory itself is wrong. For now, though, you walk through the medieval street carrying the comforting illusion that your inner fluids are being managed by professionals. The seasons will turn, your humours will shift, and the next time you feel slightly off, someone will be ready with a chart, a bowl, or a strongly worded dietary suggestion. Balance must be maintained, even if it drains you. You wake the next morning feeling not better. Not dramatically worse either. Just lighter, slightly dizzy, and vaguely aware that somewhere inside you a committee of humours is still arguing. Unfortunately for you, today's solution is not going to involve gentle spices or philosophical charts. Today your doctor decides requires commitment. When bleeding was believing, hesitation was not part of the treatment plan. You're guided to a sturdier chair this time. It has straps. That feels unnecessary. You point this out with your eyebrows. The barber surgeon, yes, this is a new professional, and yes, he also cuts hair, assures you it's merely for stability. You suspect stability is medieval for please don't faint dramatically. Bloodletting in the Middle Ages wasn't a rare last resort. It was one of the most common medical procedures in Europe. Monasteries, town physicians, and travelling healers all practiced it. In fact, some medieval calendars even marked specific good days for bloodletting, as if your veins were participating in seasonal sales. The mainstream historical fact here is striking. Bloodletting remained a dominant medical practice in Europe well into the 19th century. Even George Washington was bled during his final illness in 1799. Medieval doctors weren't uniquely committed to this idea. It had extraordinary staying power. The barber surgeon tightens a band around your upper arm. Your veins, previously minding their own business, now rise obediently to the surface like reluctant volunteers. The logic is still humoral. Too much blood? Remove it. Fever? Remove it. Inflammation? Remove it. Sore throat? Remove it. You begin to suspect that if you complained about boredom, someone would reach for a blade. Historians still argue whether patients demanded bloodletting as much as doctors prescribed it. In many cases, people genuinely believed it worked and requested it proactively. There's comfort in ritual, in doing something visible and immediate. A cut is decisive. It feels like action against the invisible. The blade flashes briefly in the light. There's a sharp sting, then warmth. You try not to focus on the bowl positioned carefully beneath your arm. The barber surgeon watches the flow with professional concentration, as if monitoring a very important soup. He murmurs something about colour and thickness. Blood wasn't just blood, it had personality. Bright red might suggest one imbalance. Darker, thicker blood could imply another. There's even a quirky tidbit that might make you shift in your chair. Some practitioners believe different veins connected to specific organs. Diagrams called vein maps indicated exactly where to cut depending on the ailment. Headache? Open a vein near the temple. Liver problem? Aim elsewhere. It was anatomical guesswork with impressive confidence. The room smells faintly metallic now. You feel a wave of light-headedness, which the barber surgeon interprets as progress. The goal isn't to drain you entirely, though occasionally they overachieved, but to restore proportion, balance, harmony, words that sound peaceful until you realise they involve measurable blood loss. And here's the strange part. Sometimes bloodletting did provide short-term relief. In cases of high blood pressure, though they had no name for it, removing blood could reduce strain on the body temporarily. Certain inflammatory conditions might feel less intense afterward. But without understanding infection, anemia, or immune response, the risks were enormous. You noticed the surgeon's other tools laid out neatly. Knives, hooks, a cauterizing iron resting in embers. He doesn't look like a villain. He looks focused, calm, practiced. This is his craft, passed down through apprenticeship rather than university lecture halls. Barber surgeons occupied an unusual social space. Physicians, who studied at universities, dealt mostly in theory and diagnosis. Surgeons, often barred from academic medicine, handled the physical procedures, cutting, stitching, amputating, and yes, trimming your beard while they were at it. There's something almost efficient about getting a shave and a minor medical crisis handled in one appointment. The bowl is half full now. The barber surgeon loosens the band and presses cloth firmly against the wound. He ties it off with a nod that suggests satisfaction. You, meanwhile, are contemplating the structural integrity of your knees. Outside, life continues. A merchant argues over grain prices. A dog barks. The world does not pause for your circulatory adventures, your help to your feet. The barber surgeon advises rest, warm broth, and avoidance of strong emotions. Strong emotions, you gather, might disturb the humours again. You make a mental note to experience only mild, historically appropriate feelings. Walking home feels like crossing a gently rocking ship. The irony is not lost on you. You sought treatment to feel stronger, yet you now require a nap simply to exist. And still, you understand why this persists. In a world without antibiotics, without diagnostic imaging, without even a solid grasp of how blood circulates, visible intervention feels powerful. You see the illness leaving your body. You watch it fill a bowl. That's tangible. That's satisfying. Invisible microbes? That would have sounded like fantasy. There are even records of seasonal mass bloodletting events, particularly in monasteries, where communities would schedule collective sessions. Imagine it. A quiet cloister courtyard, birds chirping gently, and several monks lined up to be professionally drained for optimal spiritual and physical wellness. You almost admire the dedication. As you lie down later, arm bandaged and head resting against a straw-stuffed pillow, you feel your heartbeat steady itself. Your body, resilient as ever, begins compensating for the loss. It will produce more blood. It will adapt. Human biology is stubborn like that. But you can't help noticing that each intervention leaves you slightly weaker, slightly more dependent on the next correction. The cycle feeds itself. Imbalance diagnosed, blood removed, weakness interpreted as further imbalance. And yet the barber surgeon sleeps soundly tonight, confident he has restored order to your internal universe. You drift towards sleep too, faintly aware that in this era healing often means subtraction. Less blood, less excess, less you. And tomorrow, if your head aches again, you already know what they'll reach for. The blade, after all, believes in you. You return a few days later, not because you're eager, but because medieval life has a way of injuring you whether you consent or not. A loose cobblestone, an overconfident chicken, a cartwheel with opinions. Suddenly your ankle is swollen, and your pride is wounded. And so you limp back to the one place that smells faintly of rosemary and iron. Only this time, you're not seated in the physician's dim study of parchment and philosophy. You're in the workshop of the barber surgeon. It's brighter here, louder, more practical. There are no grand diagrams of humours on the wall, just shelves of tools and folded linens that look questionably clean. A striped pole stands outside, red and white spiralling upward. The mainstream historical fact that barber pole actually symbolises blood and bandages, dating back to medieval barber surgeons who performed bloodletting and minor surgeries. You are literally walking into a logo of your own discomfort. The barber surgeon greets you like a regular customer, which, at this point, you are. In medieval Europe, physicians and surgeons occupied very different roles. Physicians studied at universities, spoke Latin, and diagnosed imbalances of humours. Surgeons, often trained through apprenticeships, handled the hands-on work. They set bones, stitched wounds, pulled teeth, and, if absolutely necessary, removed limbs, and occasionally trimmed your beard while discussing the weather. Historians still argue whether the divide between physicians and surgeons helped or harmed patients overall. On one hand, specialisation can sharpen skills. On the other, separating theory from practice sometimes meant the person cutting you open wasn't the same person deciding whether you should be cut at all. You sit on a sturdy wooden chair, no straps this time, encouraging. The barber surgeon examines your ankle with surprisingly gentle fingers. He presses along the swelling, nodding thoughtfully. There's no X-ray, of course. Diagnosis is a matter of sight, touch, and educated guesswork. If the bone is visibly misaligned, that's clear enough. If it's fractured but not dramatically crooked, things get interpretive. He announces that it's likely a sprain, or perhaps a minor break. Either way, it requires binding. Battlefield medicine, you realise, shaped much of this profession. Medieval Europe is not exactly peaceful. Skirmishes, sieges, tournaments gone wrong. Injuries are common. Barber surgeons accompany armies, patching up soldiers with alarming efficiency. They become adept at amputations because infection spreads quickly in dirty wounds. Without antiseptics or antibiotics, sometimes the only way to stop rot is to remove the limb entirely. You glance nervously at the saw on the shelf. He notices, smiles reassuringly. Probably. There's a quirky tidbit that floats through your mind. Some medieval surgeons tested whether a limb needed amputation by observing the smell. If tissue emitted a particularly foul odour, it was taken as evidence of corruption. Your fate, in part, could hinge on someone's olfactory judgment. Fortunately for you, your ankle smells merely human. He wraps it tightly with linen strips, binding it firm enough to support but not entirely cut off circulation. At least that's the goal. Medieval bandaging techniques could be surprisingly sophisticated. They understood immobilization, even if they didn't understand microbes. Instruments glint nearby. Knives, probes, hooks. A cauterizing iron rests in coals, used to seal wounds by burning them closed. It's effective at stopping bleeding. It's also, as you might imagine, deeply unpleasant. You ask, politely, what would happen if your ankle were worse? The barber surgeon shrugs with professional calm. If bone pierces skin and rot sets in, amputation might save your life. It's brutal, but sometimes effective. And here's the sobering truth. In some cases, medieval amputations did save patients. Quick removal of severely infected tissue could prevent systemic spread, not because they understood bacteria, but because they recognized patterns. Blackened flesh plus fever equals very bad. Still, survival rates varied wildly. You watch as another patient enters, a man with a deep cut along his forearm. A workshop accident, perhaps. The barber surgeon cleans the wound with wine. Alcohol does have mild antiseptic properties, though they don't articulate it that way. They just know wine is cleaner than water. The cut is stitched with practiced movements. No anaesthesia beyond perhaps a gulp of strong drink. You feel phantom sympathy pain just watching. There's a certain pragmatism here that contrasts with the philosophical musings of humours. This is less about cosmic balance, and more about immediate repair. If something is broken, bind it. If something is severed, stitch it. If something is beyond saving, remove it. And yet, infection lurks invisibly in every thread, every blade reused from the last procedure. Instruments are wiped, not sterilised. Hands are rinsed, not disinfected. The concept of germ theory won't arrive for centuries. You're living in an era where cleanliness is aesthetic, not microbiological. You hobble out with your ankle secured, oddly impressed. The barber surgeon may not know about bacteria, but he knows about bones. He's seen enough injuries to develop instinct. Experience is his textbook. As you make your way home, leaning on a borrowed stick, you reflect on the strange duality of medieval medicine. On one side, grand theories of humours and cosmic alignment. On the other, hands-on practicality shaped by war and accident. Sometimes they make things worse, bleeding a weakened patient, operating without understanding infection. But sometimes they manage small victories through sheer observation and repetition. You pass the striped pole again, red and white twisting upward like a cheerful warning sign. It's almost charming in a way, a symbol of service, of help, of someone willing to cut you open in the name of improvement. And as your ankle throbs beneath its tight linen cocoon, you can't help but think, in this world, survival often depends less on perfect knowledge, and more on how steady the surgeon's hand happens to be that day. Sleep tugs at you early. Healing, even medieval style, is exhausting. Tomorrow, you suspect, the stars themselves may have something to say about your recovery. You're just beginning to trust your tightly wrapped ankle when the bells start ringing. Not the gentle call-to-market bells, not the cheerful wedding peals. These are heavier, slower, the kind that hang in the air like a warning you can't quite outrun. Word spreads through the street in murmurs that swell into panic. Plague. You feel it before you understand it. The shift in atmosphere, the way people avoid brushing shoulders, the way doors close a little faster than usual. Somewhere nearby, someone coughs, and 3 heads turn at once. The Black Death arrives in Europe in 1347, carried along trade routes that stitch continents together. That's your mainstream historical fact for the night. The plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, though no one here knows that yet, kills an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population within just a few years. Entire villages vanish. Cities thin out like fading ink. But you don't know about bacteria. You know about humours. You know about imbalance. Your doctor knows about imbalance too. When the first cases appear, symptoms are terrifyingly dramatic. Fever spikes, lymph nodes swell into painful lumps called buboes, dark patches bloom on the skin, death can come within days. It's fast, unpredictable, and utterly indifferent to your carefully managed diet. The physician you've come to recognise now looks less certain. He dons a long robe coated in wax, gloves, and then the mask. The famous beaked mask stuffed with fragrant herbs, lavender, rosemary, mint. The idea is simple. Disease travels through bad air, miasma. The beak acts like a filter, purifying what you breathe. There's a quirky tidbit for you. Some plague doctors believe the length of the beak directly improved protection. More herbs, more safety. You glance at the exaggerated profile and can't help thinking it looks less like a healer, and more like a solemn bird of doom. Historians still argue whether most plague doctors actually wore the iconic beaked costume, or whether it became more common later. The image endures regardless, a symbol of desperation wrapped in linen and perfume. Inside homes, treatments become increasingly frantic. Bloodletting continues, of course. If plague represents corrupted blood, removing blood must help. Leeches are pressed into service with renewed enthusiasm, but draining someone already weakened by infection often hastens their decline. You watch as neighbours try everything, burning aromatic woods in the street to cleanse the air, carrying posies of flowers, avoiding certain foods believed to increase heat or moisture in the body. Some physicians recommend lancing buboes to release the poison. It's a painful procedure, and without sterile tools it can introduce even more infection. Yet occasionally, when a bubo drains naturally and the patient survives, it reinforces the belief that intervention works. There are also stranger remedies. One widely circulated cure involves placing a live chicken's rear against the swollen bubo to draw out the disease. Yes, a chicken. The logic? The animal absorbs the poison. You imagine explaining this to your future self and decide you'd rather not. Elsewhere, people carry charms or recite specific prayers. Flagellants march through towns, whipping themselves, believing the plague is divine punishment and that public penance will appease heaven. Fear reshapes society. Markets close. Trade falters. Some families barricade themselves indoors. Others flee to the countryside, unknowingly carrying the disease with them. Quarantine begins to emerge as a concept. Ships arriving in Venice are required to wait 40 days before disembarking. 40 giorni. 40 days. It's one of the few measures that genuinely slows transmission, even if they don't understand why. And here's the quiet irony. While many medieval treatments make things worse, some responses accidentally help. Isolation reduces spread. Burning contaminated bedding destroys fleas, even if they believe they're purifying air rather than eliminating vectors. But for every small success, there's overwhelming loss. You stand at your window watching a cart roll by, collecting bodies wrapped in a rough cloth. The sound of wheels over cobblestone is steady, almost rhythmic. It's horrifying and monotonous at the same time. Your doctor visits less frequently now. He looks thinner, tired. The beaked mask doesn't fully conceal the anxiety in his eyes. He prescribes tonics, vinegar mixed with herbs, meant to fortify you. He advises staying indoors, avoiding crowded gatherings. You nod obediently. Inside, you feel the strange tension of medieval medicine at its most exposed. The grand theory of humour struggles to explain something this devastating. If plague is an imbalance, it's one that ignores careful diets and seasonal adjustments. Yet no one has a better framework. You hear whispers blaming outsiders, minorities, travellers. When science fails, suspicion fills the gap. It's one of the darker chapters of human response to disease, and still some survive. Not because of leeches or chickens or fragrant masks, but because their immune systems happen to withstand the infection. Survivors become living proof of certain treatments in the eyes of observers. Ah, someone says, she drank rosemary vinegar daily. The pattern is noted. The myth grows. You remain uninfected, for now. Perhaps luck, perhaps isolation, perhaps sheer narrative mercy. As weeks pass, the bells ring less often. The outbreak burns through the population and slowly recedes. Streets reopen cautiously. Markets resume, though quieter. The plague leaves scars, not just on bodies, but on medicine itself. Confidence is shaken. If the humours can't prevent this, what else might be wrong? You step outside into thinner air. The city changed. There are fewer voices, more empty doorways. The barber pole still twists red and white in the breeze, but it feels subdued. Medieval doctors did what they could with the knowledge they had. They wore masks filled with herbs, believing scent could save them. They drained blood, lanced swellings, prescribed warmth or coolness based on ancient texts. Often, they made things worse, but sometimes, by accident, by observation, by sheer luck, they stumbled onto fragments of truth. You walk carefully down the street, breathing through a cloth scented lightly with mint. It probably doesn't help. But it smells reassuring, and in times like these, reassurance is a kind of medicine too. You survive the plague years mostly intact, which in medieval terms makes you something of a statistical overachiever. Your ankle has healed into a slightly dramatic reminder of cobblestones, and your trust in leeches has matured. Now, instead of rushing straight to blades and bowls, you find yourself wandering into a different kind of healing space. Not a stone infirmary, not a barber's workshop. A cottage at the edge of town, where bundles of herbs hang upside down from dark wooden beams, filling the air with a scent that's earthy, bitter, and faintly hopeful. Here, medicine feels softer, less metallic, more like tea. Herbal remedies were a cornerstone of medieval healthcare, and this is your mainstream historical fact for the evening. Much of everyday treatment relied on plant knowledge preserved in manuscripts called herbals. These books described plants, their temperatures, hot, cold, moist, dry, and how they might rebalance your humours. Monks copied them, housewives referenced them, travelling healers memorised them. You sit at a rough wooden table while a woman crushes dried chamomile with a stone pestle. She doesn't wear a beaked mask or carry a saw. She asks about your sleep, your digestion, your mood. You feel seen. Lavender for calm, willow bark for pain. Amusingly, willow contains salicin, a chemical related to modern aspirin, though no one here would phrase it that way. Honey for wounds, which actually does have mild antibacterial properties. Sometimes, by observation alone, medieval healers stumbled onto genuinely effective treatments. But the line between helpful and harmful is thin. She reaches for a jar labelled in careful script. Inside is something darker, stronger. You ask what it's for. Purging, she says gently. Ah yes, purgatives. If bloodletting removes excess through veins, purging does so more, enthusiastically through other exits. Herbs like hellebore or coleocanth could induce vomiting or intense diarrhea. The theory remains humoral. Expel the imbalance. flush out the bad. The result is often dehydration layered on top of whatever illness you already had. There's a quirky tidbit that might make you glance at your teacup suspiciously. Some medieval remedies included powdered gemstones, or even ground mummy imported from Egypt. Yes, actual mummified remains were sold as medicinal ingredients under the name mumia. The logic: ancient bodies must contain powerful properties. You silently hope your current brew is plant-based only. Historians still argue whether folk healers were more effective than formally trained physicians. On one hand, they relied heavily on tradition and superstition. On the other, they were deeply embedded in their communities, observing patterns over time. When a certain herb soothed coughs consistently, it stayed in use. You sip the chamomile infusion. It's warm, mildly bitter, comforting. There's power in ritual here too, but it feels less aggressive, less subtractive. Instead of removing blood, you're adding warmth, adding fragrance, adding care. Charms often accompany these remedies. A sprig of rosemary tied with red thread to ward off illness. A whispered prayer over the mortar and pestle. From your modern perspective, it's easy to dismiss this as superstition, but in a world where disease is mysterious and often fatal, combining physical treatment with spiritual reassurance makes a certain psychological sense. You remember the plague doctor's heavy mask and compare it to this small kitchen of herbs. Both are attempts to impose order on chaos, one through elaborate costume and theory, the other through familiarity and scent. She hands you a salve for your still aching ankle, comfrey and beeswax. Comfrey was historically believed to knit bone, though modern science would raise an eyebrow at that claim. Still, massaging the area with a warm salve encourages circulation and gentle movement. You feel marginally better, not cured, just tended to. Outside, the wind moves through tall grass. Inside, bundles of sage and thyme sway slightly from the rafters. There's no dramatic bleeding bowl here, no cauterizing iron glowing in embers, just slow preparation. Yet even this gentler world has risks. Incorrect plant identification can be deadly. Some herbs look nearly identical to toxic counterparts. Dosage is guesswork. A little might soothe, a little more might poison. Without standardized measurements, remedies vary from healer to healer. You imagine two cottages in neighbouring villages, each brewing slightly different potions for the same ailment. One helps, one harms. Over time, stories determine reputation, and reputation is everything. You ask about fevers. She suggests elderflower tea to encourage sweating, another common medieval approach. Sweat out the illness. It's less violent than bloodletting, but follows similar logic. Imbalance must exit the body somehow. As you leave with small cloth-wrapped bundles tucked into your pouch, you feel a quiet appreciation for this branch of medieval medicine. It's imperfect, sometimes dangerous, occasionally absurd, but often rooted in close observation of the natural world. You think of the powdered mummy again and decide to focus on the lavender instead. The truth is, medieval doctors often made things worse when they intervened dramatically, bleeding weakened patients, purging fragile bodies, cutting without understanding infection. But herbal knowledge, passed carefully through generations, sometimes mitigated harm rather than amplifying it. You walk back toward town, the scent of rosemary rising from your pouch. The barber pole is visible in the distance, its red stripes catching the fading light. Between the pole and the cottage lies the full spectrum of medieval healing, steel and salve, theory and tradition. Tonight, you choose tea over leeches. You heat water slowly, watching steam curl upward like a quiet promise. The cup warms your hands. The bitterness settles into something almost sweet. And as you sip, you realize that sometimes the most effective medieval medicine isn't the one that drains or burns or purges. Sometimes it's simply the one that lets you rest. Your ankle improves, your sleep deepens with lavender and chamomile, and for a brief, fragile moment, you believe you might avoid further medical adventures. Unfortunately, the stars have other plans. Not metaphorically, literally. You wake before dawn to a polite but urgent knock. Your physician stands outside, clutching a rolled parchment and squinting at the paling sky as if it personally offended him. He explains, calmly, confidently, that your recent fatigue may not be about humors alone. It may be about Mars. Astrology and medicine are inseparable companions in much of the medieval world. That's your mainstream historical fact for this section. Physicians often consulted astrological charts before diagnosing or treating patients. Medical schools taught students to calculate planetary positions because the heavens were believed to influence bodily fluids directly. You stare at him, wondering how your ankle sprain offended a distant red planet. Inside his study, he unrolls an intricate chart. Circles within circles, symbols marking constellations, careful lines mapping the zodiac across the human body. This is the Zodiac Man, a common medieval illustration showing which astrological sign governs which body part. Aries rules the head, Taurus the neck, Gemini the arms, and so on, all the way down to Pisces at your feet. You glance at your ankle. "Ah," he murmurs, tracing a finger thoughtfully. "Aquarius season." Of course it is. Historians still argue whether medieval physicians truly believed celestial bodies caused illness, or whether astrology functioned more as a scheduling system layered onto humoral theory. Either way, it shaped real decisions. Certain days were deemed favourable for bloodletting, others were strictly forbidden. Performing surgery when the moon was in the wrong sign could be considered reckless. The doctor peers out the window, gauging the moon's phase with narrowed eyes. Full moons were thought to intensify bodily fluids. After all, if the moon moves tides, surely it tugs at your internal oceans of blood and phlegm too. There's a strange internal logic to it. He informs you that today is not ideal for any invasive procedure. Mars is poorly positioned, and Mars governs heat, aggression, and sharp instruments. You silently thank Mars for its temporary restraint. Instead, he recommends adjusting your regimen in accordance with planetary influences, more cooling foods, avoid strenuous activity while Saturn lingers in an unfavourable house, perhaps a mild tonic timed precisely at dawn when Mercury offers clarity. You nod as though this makes perfect sense. There's a quirky tidbit that might amuse you. Some medieval doctors carried portable astrolabes, intricate brass instruments used to calculate celestial positions. Imagine a physician pausing mid-consultation to measure the altitude of a star before deciding whether to apply a poultice. Medicine by astronomy. You picture your barber surgeon squinting at the sky before picking up a saw. It's oddly reassuring and deeply alarming at the same time, but astrology wasn't fringe. It was academically respectable. Universities like Bologna and Paris incorporated it into medical curricula. The cosmos was seen as an interconnected system. You, a microcosm reflecting the macrocosm. If planets influenced crops and weather, why not spleens and ankles? Your doctor marks a future date on parchment. A more auspicious window should further treatment be required. Until then, rest. Observe. Avoid excess heat of temperament. You step outside into the cool morning air. The sky is streaked pink and gold, utterly indifferent to your internal drama. Yet there's something soothing about believing the universe has a schedule. That illness isn't random chaos, but part of a celestial choreography. Still, you can't help noticing how easily astrology might delay necessary intervention. If someone urgently needs surgery but the stars disagree, hesitation could cost precious time. Conversely, choosing an auspicious day might offer psychological comfort that improves a patient's confidence, and sometimes confidence helps. You wander past neighbours discussing harvests under the same sky your doctor just analysed. They don't see malefic houses or planetary conjunctions, they see weather. Back in your room that night, you look out at the moon. It hangs steady and bright, serene in its distance. Somewhere in town, someone is being bled because the lunar phase permits it. Somewhere else, someone waits because it doesn't. The interplay between observation and imagination fascinates you. Medieval physicians carefully track symptoms, pulse rates, urine colour, even holding flasks of urine up to light for examination. Uroscopy is a respected diagnostic practice. They observe meticulously. But interpretation filters through a cosmological lens. You think back to the plague years. Did Mars get blamed? Did Saturn bear responsibility for sorrow? It must have been tempting to assign patterns to tragedy. Astrology offers order. It also offers distraction. As you lie down, ankle propped comfortably, you feel oddly peaceful. Perhaps because tonight no blade is approaching. No leech bowl writhes in the corner. The heavens apparently advise patience, and patience, unlike purgatives, is unlikely to dehydrate you. The medieval world hums softly beyond your walls, oxen shifting in stalls, distant laughter from a tavern, wind brushing thatched roofs. Above it all, stars burn steadily, ancient and unreachable. Your doctor believes they shape your blood. You're not entirely convinced, but as sleep approaches, You admit there's something comforting about imagining the universe paying attention, even if it occasionally schedules your medical procedures according to Aquarius. Tomorrow perhaps the moon will move, and with it your treatment plan. For now, you rest beneath a sky full of distant decisions, grateful that at least tonight, Mars is minding its own business. You decide, after consulting both your ankle and the current position of Saturn, that perhaps what you really need is a proper hospital visit, not the barber's workshop, not the herb-scented cottage, something official, structured, reassuringly institutional. So you make your way to the nearest medieval hospital. It looks impressive from the outside. Arched doorway, stone walls, maybe even a small chapel attached. Inside, though, the atmosphere is less modern healthcare facility and more large echoing hall of shared vulnerability. Rows of narrow beds line the walls. Some patients lie quietly, others cough, groan, or stare at the ceiling beams as if negotiating with them personally. Candles flicker. The air is thick with the scent of bodies, straw mattresses, and the faint attempt at cleanliness. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Medieval hospitals were often run by religious orders and functioned more as places of charity and spiritual care than centres of advanced medical treatment. They provided shelter, food, and prayer for the sick and poor. Medical intervention, in the technical sense, was sometimes secondary. You're assigned a bed not far from the door. Privacy is not a medieval luxury. Illness is communal here. If your neighbour snores, you experience it fully. If your neighbour develops something contagious, well, congratulations on your shared spiritual journey. Hygiene, by modern standards, is not quite the priority you might hope for. Bedding is changed infrequently. Floors are swept, but not disinfected, because the concept of microscopic pathogens doesn't exist yet. Illness is still largely explained by humours, miasma, or divine will. Historians still argue whether medieval hospitals were actually dirtier than ordinary homes, or whether they simply concentrated the sick in one place, making outbreaks more visible. Either way, crowding increases risk, even if no one understands why. A nurse, likely a member of a religious order, brings you broth. It's thin but warm. Food is medicine here. Rest is medicine. Prayer is medicine. There's something undeniably compassionate about it. But then you notice the patient 2 beds down, coughing heavily into a cloth that looks suspiciously reused. Another patient has an open wound wrapped in linen that's seen better decades. You watch a caretaker rinse a bowl in water that's been used several times already. It's not neglect, it's limitation. Without germ theory, without the later insights of people like Ignaz Semmelweis or Louis Pasteur, cleanliness is mostly about visible dirt. If something looks clean, it is assumed to be clean. The idea that invisible organisms might travel from one patient to another on hands or instruments would sound like fantasy. There's a quirky tidbit drifting through your drowsy thoughts. In some hospitals, beds were shared by multiple patients at once, sometimes even sleeping in shifts. Space was precious. Illness did not wait politely for individual accommodations. You shift slightly, grateful at least for your own small mattress of straw. A physician makes rounds, accompanied by students. They discuss cases in Latin, occasionally gesturing toward you as if you're a mildly interesting diagram. Your pulse is taken. Your urine may be examined in a glass flask held up to the light, a practice called uroscopy, taken very seriously in medieval diagnostics. The colour, clarity, even imagined sediment patterns are interpreted like omens. And here's the strange thing. Despite the lack of sanitation, some hospitals genuinely improved outcomes, not through cutting-edge procedures, but through basic care, regular meals, shelter from the elements, someone checking on you daily. For the poor especially, that could mean the difference between life and death. Still, infections spread easily in close quarters. You overhear whispers of hospital fever, what we would now recognise as infections acquired within medical facilities. If someone arrives with a simple injury, they might leave with something far more serious. You begin to understand how medieval medicine sometimes made things worse not through malice or ignorance alone, but through structure. Concentrating illness without understanding transmission creates new pathways for disease. Night falls, candles dim, murmured prayers echo softly against stone walls. There's comfort in collective ritual. Even if treatment options are limited, no one is entirely alone here. You find yourself drifting into half-sleep, listening to the quiet rhythm of breathing around you. It's oddly soothing, like waves. though occasionally interrupted by a dramatic cough. A caretaker walks by, adjusting blankets. She pauses at your bed, ensuring your bandaged ankle is elevated. It's a small gesture, but thoughtful. In the morning, sunlight filters through narrow windows, illuminating floating dust particles that dance in the beams. You watch them lazily, unaware that in another few centuries, someone will peer through a microscope and discover an entirely new universe in specks like those. For now, they're just dust. You sit up slowly, feeling no worse than when you arrived, which, in medieval hospital terms, counts as success. The broth helped, the rest helped. The lack of leeches helped. Yet you can't shake the awareness that recovery here is partly a matter of luck. If the patient beside you worsens overnight, proximity alone could tip your own balance. As you prepare to leave, stepping carefully back into the street, you reflect on the paradox. Medieval hospitals are acts of mercy, built on incomplete knowledge. They offer care and community, yet sometimes amplify the very illnesses they seek to soothe. The striped barber pole catches your eye again down the road. The herb cottage smoke curls gently in the opposite direction. Between charity halls and surgical workshops, astrology charts and leech bowls, you navigate a world trying, earnestly, imperfectly, to heal. And as you breathe in the morning air, grateful simply to be upright, you realise that sometimes surviving medieval medicine is less about brilliant treatment and more about avoiding the wrong bed. You leave the hospital feeling cautiously victorious, which in medieval terms means you are upright, mildly hydrated, and not currently being bled. That counts as a win. Unfortunately, triumph is short-lived, because sometime during the night a new torment announces itself. Your tooth begins to throb. At first it's subtle, a dull pulse in the back of your jaw. By midday it's a drumbeat. By evening it feels like a blacksmith has taken up residence inside your skull and is forging horseshoes against your molars. You return, reluctantly, to the barber surgeon. Of course you do. Dentistry in the Middle Ages is not a specialised field. It's a side quest. He peers into your mouth with the same calm curiosity he uses for broken bones. There are no x-rays, no anaesthesia beyond perhaps a sip of strong ale. He taps the offending tooth with a small metal instrument. The pain flashes bright and immediate. He nods. Toothaches in medieval Europe were often blamed on toothworms. That's your quirky historical tidbit for this section. Many people believe tiny worms burrowed inside teeth, causing decay and pain. Some treatments involved fumigating the mouth with herbal smoke to drive the worm out. If you imagined your dental hygiene couldn't get more medieval, congratulations. Historians still argue how widespread the literal belief in toothworms was among learned physicians versus common folk. But the image persisted for centuries, and honestly, when you can't see bacteria, worms feel like a reasonable villain. The mainstream historical fact here is blunt. Tooth extraction was the primary solution for severe dental pain. If a tooth hurt badly enough, it came out. End of story. Fillings were rare and rudimentary. Preventative dentistry was practically non-existent. You either metal forceps. The barber surgeon does not consult the stars this time. Mars apparently governs sharp instruments, but your jaw is beyond astrological diplomacy. He advises you to brace yourself. You consider bargaining. You consider embracing a life of liquid soups, but the pain decides for you. He grips the tooth. There is pressure, a twist. The sound, well, let's keep this PG-13. It's unpleasant. You feel a sudden release, followed by warmth and the metallic taste of blood. He holds up the extracted tooth triumphantly, inspecting it as though expecting a worm to wave goodbye. He packs the space with cloth and instructs you to bite down. Oddly enough, once the immediate shock subsides, the throbbing is gone. Replaced by soreness, yes, but the deep pulsing agony has vanished. It's a crude solution, but effective in its simplicity. You stagger slightly, reflecting on how medieval medicine sometimes defaulted to removal. Hurt, remove, infected, remove, corrupted, remove. It's direct, decisive, and occasionally life-saving, though often at cost. But dentistry is only the beginning of cranial adventures. If headaches persist beyond reason, some medieval practitioners turn to trepanation, the act of drilling or scraping a hole into the skull. The idea predates the Middle Ages by thousands of years, but it continues in some regions as a treatment for pressure, seizures, or even mental disturbances. You try very hard not to imagine it. The logic again centres on imbalance or trapped spirits. If something is wrong inside the head, perhaps releasing pressure or evil influences through a carefully made opening might help. Surprisingly, archaeological evidence shows that some patients survived trepanation. Skulls have been found with healed bone growth around the openings, which means at least a few people walked around medieval towns with discreetly ventilated heads. Historians still argue about the survival rates and exact reasons for the procedure in different contexts. Was it medical? Ritual? Both? The line between science and belief was often porous. You rinse your mouth gently with wine, as instructed. Alcohol stings, but it also provides mild antiseptic benefit. Not that anyone here uses the word antiseptic. Walking home, tongue cautiously exploring the new gap in your teeth, you reflect on the simplicity of extraction. No humoral chart, no zodiac diagram, just pain identified and eliminated by force. There's something almost refreshing about it, and yet dental infections could still be deadly. If bacteria spread from the tooth into the bloodstream, a concept unknown at the time, it could lead to serious complications. Without antibiotics, even a small abscess might escalate dangerously. You pass a group of children laughing in the street, several already missing teeth from natural childhood processes. You wonder how many adult smiles hide similar gaps from surgical necessity. Back in your room, you lie down, jaw tender but mercifully quiet. The absence of pain feels luxurious. Medieval medicine, you're realizing, is a patchwork of extremes. On one end, elaborate theories connecting your spleen to Saturn. On the other, a firm grip and a swift pull. Sometimes the dramatic intervention makes things worse. Blood loss, infection, unnecessary drilling. Sometimes it simply removes the immediate problem and hopes your body handles the rest. You run your tongue over the empty space again, oddly fascinated. There's a strange resilience in human beings. Despite leeches, purges, crowded hospitals and questionable dentistry, many survive. Bodies adapt, wounds close, bone knits, gums heal. And occasionally a throbbing pain that once consumed your thoughts becomes nothing more than a tender memory. You drift towards sleep carefully, mindful of your jaw, grateful that tonight no one is approaching your skull with a drill. The blacksmith in your head has packed up his tools, and for now that's more than enough. Your jaw heals, your ankle behaves, your humours for the moment are suspiciously cooperative. You begin to think you've mastered medieval survival, until you notice that not all healers are treated equally in this world. You're walking past the edge of town when you see a small gathering outside the familiar herb-scented cottage. The same woman who once handed you chamomile now stands before a stern-looking official. Her bundles of rosemary and sage hang quietly in the doorway, unaware that they may soon be labelled suspicious. Women have long served as healers, midwives, herbalists, caretakers, especially in rural communities. That's your mainstream historical fact here. Much of everyday medical care in medieval Europe was provided by women, particularly in childbirth and herbal medicine. Formal universities excluded them, but practical knowledge thrived in kitchens and cottages. Yet that knowledge could also invite danger. When medicine fails, or when fear spreads, communities look for explanations, and sometimes they look for scapegoats. Historians still argue whether the association between women healers and witch accusations was as widespread in the early medieval period as later folklore suggests. The major witch hunts peaked in the early modern era, not the High Middle Ages. Still, suspicion toward women with medical knowledge simmered in certain times and places. You watch as the official questions her about a recent illness in town. A child fell sick despite herbal treatments. The implication hangs unspoken. If your remedies didn't work, were they ever remedies at all? It's a dangerous shift, from healer to suspect. There's a quirky tidbit that lingers uneasily. Some medical texts warned against wise women, whose charms and potions were deemed superstitious or even demonic. Ironically, many of the same physicians who dismissed them relied on similar herbal ingredients, just wrapped in Latin terminology. The difference was often authority. University-trained physicians wore robes, cited Galen, and spoke in scholarly language. Midwives spoke plainly and passed knowledge orally. When outcomes were good, both were praised. When outcomes were bad, one group faced far harsher scrutiny. You recall how gently she prepared your chamomile, how carefully she wrapped your ankle salve. Nothing about it felt sinister. It felt practical. Childbirth especially reveals the complexity of medieval medicine. Midwives guided most deliveries. They understood positioning, pacing, and the rhythms of labour through experience. Without surgical options like modern caesarean sections, outcomes depended heavily on skill and luck. Complications, however, were common, and when tragedy struck, explanations were sought. In some regions, midwives were required to swear religious oaths to ensure their practices aligned with church doctrine. Spiritual oversight intertwined with medical practice. Healing was never purely physical. It was moral, social, cosmic. You step closer, listening quietly. The official eventually leaves without formal accusation, but the tension lingers. Reputation is fragile. One failed remedy can outweigh a dozen successes. Meanwhile, male physicians continue prescribing purges and bloodletting with institutional backing. When those fail, the blame falls on imbalance, fate, or divine will, not personal malice. It's not a simple story of oppression. It's a complex web of power, literacy, and authority. But the imbalance is visible. Women's medical knowledge often survived through community trust rather than formal recognition. Recipes memorized, techniques demonstrated, secrets shared quietly from one generation to the next, and sometimes those remedies genuinely helped. Willow bark easing pain, honey preventing wound rot, certain herbs reducing inflammation. Observation mattered, even if explanation lagged behind. You think about how medieval doctors often made things worse through aggressive interventions. Meanwhile, many women healers focused on support, comfort, nourishment, gentle remedies, less dramatic, less theatrical, sometimes safer, but not always, incorrect dosages, misidentified plants, superstitious additions. The risks were real. As dusk settles, the cottage door closes softly. The bundles of herbs sway in the evening breeze as if whispering their own defence. You walk home reflecting on how medicine isn't just about knowledge, it's about who is allowed to hold it. Authority shapes trust. Trust shapes survival. In your own small medical journey, you've experienced the full spectrum: leeches and lunar charts, hospital halls and dental forceps, herbal teas and battlefield bandages. And now you see the invisible politics behind it all. Healing in the medieval world is not only a battle against illness, it's a negotiation between tradition and institution, between written text and lived experience. You pause outside your door, glancing back once more at the cottage's faintly glowing window. Tomorrow someone will knock seeking help, and whether that knock is answered with respect or suspicion may depend less on the remedy and more on who prepares it. You slip inside, grateful for your relatively uneventful evening. Your humours feel balanced enough. Your jaw no longer throbs. The stars appear calm. For now, at least, no one is accusing you of witchcraft for drinking chamomile. And in medieval times, that alone counts as a peaceful night. You might assume that if anyone in the medieval world had access to the very best medicine, it would be royalty. Kings, queens, dukes with dramatic capes and even more dramatic expectations. Surely, with gold and influence, they could purchase better outcomes than the rest of you, you would think. But as you stand in the echoing stone corridor of a royal court, purely as an observer of course, you realise that even crowns cannot negotiate with flawed theory. Royal physicians were often among the most educated medical minds of their time. That's your mainstream historical fact. Medieval rulers employed trained physicians who studied classical texts and practiced according to humoral theory. These doctors had status, wealth, and access to extensive medical libraries. What they did not have was modern science. You watch as a court physician hovers near a monarch who looks distinctly unwell, pale, sweating, clutching his abdomen. The room smells faintly of incense and worry. Advisors whisper along the walls. A tray of gleaming instruments sits nearby, alongside jars of herbs and carefully labelled tonics. The diagnosis is delivered with solemn authority. An excess of choleric heat, perhaps aggravated by rich foods and stress of governance. The solution, naturally bloodletting. Historians still argue whether royal physicians felt greater pressure to act decisively, even aggressively, because failure could cost not only reputation but life. When a king is ill, doing nothing is not politically acceptable. Action must be visible, and so the bowl appears. You can't help recalling your own light-headed stroll home after similar treatment. Now imagine losing blood while responsible for an entire kingdom. There's a particularly sobering example that echoes through history. King Charles II of England, though technically later than the medieval period, was subjected to an extraordinary series of treatments during his final illness in 1685. Multiple bleedings, purges, enemas, and more. While this falls in the early modern era, it reflects how deeply entrenched these practices remained. Even monarchs were not spared from enthusiastic intervention. The barber surgeon stands ready. The court physician nods. The cut is made. The king weakens. It's difficult to say whether the illness alone would have proven fatal. But repeated bleeding and purging certainly did not help. Removing blood from someone already compromised can tip the balance from fragile stability into irreversible decline. And yet, from the physician's perspective, this is textbook medicine. There's a quirky tidbit that feels almost surreal. Some royal doctors prepared elaborate unicorn horn remedies, powders made from narwhal tusks believed to neutralize poison. In courts where intrigue and assassination were constant fears, antidotes were prized. The horn, rare and exotic, symbolized purity and protection. You imagine paying a fortune for powdered sea creature tooth and calling it mythological insurance. The king is given a spiced tonic next. His pulse is checked repeatedly. Astrological charts may even be consulted discreetly. When the powerful fall ill, every theory is mobilized. Humoral, herbal, celestial. You watch tension ripple through the court as the monarch drifts in and out of consciousness. Royalty had access to better nutrition, cleaner quarters, and more attentive care than most peasants. But their treatments often followed the same flawed frameworks. Wealth could amplify intervention rather than wisdom. Historians still debate whether some physicians privately doubted excessive bloodletting but feared contradicting established authority. After all, Galen's teachings were revered. Challenging them required extraordinary courage and evidence that didn't yet exist. The room grows quieter. If the king recovers, the physician is praised as brilliant. If the king dies, explanations are found. The illness was too severe. Divine will intervened. The humours were too corrupted to save. Rarely does the blade itself face blame. You step back into the corridor feeling a strange mixture of awe and melancholy. Power does not grant immunity from medical misjudgment. In some cases, it magnifies it. Outside the palace, common folk still sip chamomile and avoid bad air. Inside, gold goblets hold purgatives strong enough to fell an ox. You think of how often medieval doctors made things worse not through cruelty, but through certainty. Certainty that imbalance must be corrected aggressively. Certainty that ancient texts were infallible. Certainty that doing more equaled caring more. Even kings suffer under that certainty. As you wander back toward the town, the palace towers shrinking behind you, you reflect on the strange equality of vulnerability. Whether peasant or prince, you bleed the same colour. You faint the same way. You fear the same darkness behind closed eyes. Medicine in this era is earnest, structured, sometimes compassionate, but often misguided. And if a crown cannot shield a monarch from overzealous treatment, you realise something quietly profound. In the medieval world, survival depends less on status, and more on whether your physician decides to reach for the leeches one too many times. You pull your cloak tighter against the evening chill, oddly grateful for your modest life. No royal doctors hovering, no political pressure demanding dramatic cures. Just you, your moderately balanced humours, and the hope that tomorrow's ailments, if any, require nothing more ambitious than tea. You might imagine that somewhere, behind thick monastery walls or inside the grand halls of a university, someone has figured it all out. That beyond the leeches and lunar charts, there must be a room filled with clarity, a place where medicine is precise, measured, unquestionably correct. So you wander, in your mind at least, into a medieval medical school. The lecture hall smells faintly of ink and wool. Students sit on hard benches, their attention fixed on a robed scholar reading from a heavy manuscript. The text is not new. In fact, it is ancient, copied and recopied for centuries. That's your mainstream historical fact. Medieval European medicine was deeply rooted in the works of ancient authorities, especially Galen and Hippocrates, as well as later Islamic scholars like Avicenna. These texts formed the backbone of university curricula from places like Bologna, Paris and Oxford. The professor reads in Latin, occasionally pausing to elaborate on the balance of humours, the properties of organs, the influence of seasons. Students scribble notes carefully. Questioning the foundational theory is not encouraged. The goal is mastery of established knowledge, not experimentation. Historians still argue whether medieval universities were intellectually stagnant or simply constrained by the tools available. It's easy to mock their reliance on ancient texts, but those texts represented the best organised medical knowledge available at the time. Still, there's a catch. Galen's anatomical work, for example, was largely based on animal dissection, monkeys, pigs, because human dissection was limited and controversial for long periods. As a result, certain anatomical assumptions were simply wrong. The human jaw is one bone, not two. The liver does not have 5 distinct lobes, as Galen described. But if Galen said it, it must be so. You sit quietly at the back of the hall, listening as the professor describes how blood is continuously produced in the liver and consumed by the body, not circulated in a closed loop. That crucial insight about circulation won't arrive until William Harvey in the 17th century. For now, blood is more like a renewable resource than a travelling river. There's a quirky tidbit that feels almost theatrical. During rare public dissections of executed criminals, a lecturer would sit high above the body, reading from Galen, while a barber surgeon performed the cutting. If the anatomy didn't match the text, the body, not the book, was considered flawed. You imagine the corpse being silently blamed for its own structural inaccuracies. Education in this world is about preservation, not disruption. Students memorise humoral correspondences, diagnostic techniques like uroscopy, and the proper timing of treatments according to astrology. And yet something subtle is shifting. Translation movements, particularly from Arabic into Latin, have expanded the medical canon. Scholars like Avicenna compiled encyclopedic works synthesizing Greek and Islamic medical knowledge. Observation is valued, even if framed within humoral theory. You wander through a scriptorium where monks carefully copy illustrated herbals. The drawings are stylized, sometimes more symbolic than botanically precise. A plant that looks vaguely like a carrot might represent several species. Misinterpretation is easy. Dosage instructions are often imprecise. A handful of this, a pinch of that. Standardization remains elusive. You can see how medieval doctors, armed with these texts, approached patients with genuine scholarship. They weren't guessing blindly. They were applying a structured system passed down for over a millennium. The problem was that the system itself had limits. When bloodletting failed, the solution wasn't to question circulation theory. It was to adjust the quantity removed. When purging weakened a patient, it was assumed the excess humour was especially stubborn. The framework absorbed failure without collapsing. Historians still debate how much quiet skepticism existed among individual practitioners. Surely some noticed patterns that didn't quite align. But challenging foundational authorities risked professional isolation, and so the cycle continued. You step outside the university into crisp air, reflecting on how powerful written knowledge can be. A book, copied faithfully, can shape centuries of practice. It can preserve insight and preserve error. The irony is gentle but persistent. Medieval medicine valued learning deeply. It revered scholarship. It institutionalized study. Yet without systematic experimentation and tools like microscopes, many conclusions remained untested assumptions. You think of your own experiences, the leeches, the extraction, the herbal tea. Each intervention traced back to lines in these manuscripts, and yet not all was lost in dogma. Careful observation of symptoms, development of hospitals, recording of case histories, even the act of formal medical education laid groundwork for future revolutions. The structure existed, it simply needed new data. As twilight settles, you imagine a future student daring to question the liver's role in blood production, daring to measure, to test, to challenge Galen respectfully but firmly. For now, though, the lecture hall hums with confident recitation. You walk home past candlelit windows, carrying the weight of ancient authority in your thoughts. Medieval doctors often made things worse not because they lacked intelligence, but because their intellectual inheritance was incomplete. They stood on the shoulders of giants, but sometimes those giants were slightly mistaken, and it would take centuries and courage for anyone to gently suggest that perhaps the corpse in front of them wasn't wrong after all. You've survived fevers, leeches, royal physicians, and university lectures. You might reasonably assume that if anything is certain in the medieval world, it's this. When plague arrives, surely everyone recognises it. They do, they just don't understand it. You first notice the silence, markets thin, church bells ring more often, a cart creaks past carrying something poorly covered, whispers drift through narrow streets, someone says the word pestilence, someone else refuses to say it at all. Your mainstream historical fact: the Black Death swept through Europe between 1347 and 1351, killing an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the population in some regions. It was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, transmitted primarily through fleas carried by rats, though medieval people did not know this. What they did know was that people developed sudden fever, weakness, and painful swellings, buboes, under the arms or in the groin. Many died within days. You watch as a physician approaches a patient's bedside. The room smells of vinegar and fear. The doctor wears layered robes and carries a pouch of herbs. In some later outbreaks, physicians adopted the now iconic beaked mask stuffed with aromatic plants, though that image became more common in the 17th century. The diagnosis: corrupted air, miasma. Perhaps planetary alignment is to blame. In fact, a group of scholars at the University of Paris issued a report in 1348 attributing the plague partly to a rare conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter and Mars in 1345, which they believed poisoned the air. You imagine looking up at the night sky and seeing not stars but accusation. Treatments varied. Fires were lit in streets to purify the air. Vinegar was splashed on surfaces. Herbs were burned. People carried pomanders filled with spices. Bloodletting was still attempted, though many physicians recognised how quickly plague victims declined. There's a grim, almost surreal tidbit. Some towns paid watchmen to sit with the sick, not to heal them, but to ensure they didn't wander into public spaces. Quarantine, in primitive form, began to emerge. The port city of Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, implemented isolation measures for arriving ships in 1377, an early version of what would become standardised quarantine. You notice something else. Panic doesn't follow logic. Minorities are blamed. Strangers are suspected. In many regions, Jewish communities were falsely accused of poisoning wells, leading to horrific persecutions. Historians still debate how much civic leaders truly believed these accusations versus using them to redirect public fury. Meanwhile, physicians are trapped in an impossible position. They apply everything they know, balancing humours, purging, cooling compresses. Some recommend avoiding baths, believing open pores allow poisoned air inside. Others advise moderate exercise. Advice contradicts itself from town to town, and still people die. It's one thing for a treatment to fail slowly. It's another for entire households to collapse within a week. The scale overwhelms theory. You walk past a house marked with a symbol warning others away. The door remains shut. Inside, someone coughs weakly. Outside, neighbours leave food at a cautious distance. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Medieval doctors often made things worse during plague outbreaks, not because their treatments directly caused the disease, but because their explanations prevented effective prevention. Without understanding contagion, efforts focused on air quality rather than rodent control. Without germ theory, isolation was inconsistent and sometimes too late. And yet, something important is happening beneath the tragedy. Observation. Records are kept, patterns are noted. Cities that implement stricter isolation sometimes fare better. Ports begin formalising waiting periods for ships. The concept of contagion, though not yet scientifically defined, starts to take shape in collective memory. Historians still argue how much the Black Death weakened blind faith in established medical authority. When half your patients die despite textbook treatment, certainty cracks. Questions begin to whisper at the edges of scholarship. You stand at the edge of a burial ground, wind sharp against your face. The sheer scale of mortality is almost beyond comprehension. No leech, no tonic, no astrological chart can negotiate with this bacterium. But medieval medicine does not vanish. It adapts slowly. It documents. It builds hospitals. It experiments cautiously within its framework. The tragedy exposes limitations, but it also forces administrative innovation. Public health boards, quarantine laws, mortality tracking. In the darkest chapter, seeds of structural change are planted. You turn away from the city walls, reflecting on how fragile certainty becomes in the face of mass death. The doctors you've encountered, earnest, educated, sometimes tragically confident, are now confronted with something that refuses to obey humoral logic. The plague doesn't care about excess choler. It doesn't respect royal blood. It doesn't consult Galen. And as you walk into the uncertain quiet that follows, you realise something sobering. Survival in the medieval world is often less about the brilliance of treatment and more about the luck of exposure. The bells continue ringing behind you. This time, no one reaches for leeches. They reach for distance. By now, you've seen enough to suspect something unsettling. Medieval doctors weren't villains. They weren't careless. They weren't indifferent. They were confident. And confidence, in the wrong framework, can be dangerous. You step into what might be called a hospital, though it doesn't look like the sterile corridors you imagine. In medieval Europe, many hospitals were charitable institutions run by religious orders. Their purpose was as much spiritual care as physical healing. Your mainstream historical fact: hospitals such as the Hôtel Dieu de Paris, founded in the 7th century, served the poor, sick and pilgrims. Care focused on shelter, prayer, basic nursing and comfort. Physicians might visit, but daily care was often provided by monks or nuns. You walk between rows of beds, sometimes 2 patients to a mattress. The air is thick with incense and humanity. A nun adjusts a blanket. A monk offers broth to someone too weak to lift their head. For many patients, this was the best care available. Cleanliness, though not understood in germ theory terms, was sometimes better in monastic settings than in crowded urban homes. Fresh linens might be provided. Simple herbal remedies offered relief. Prayer, of course, was constant. And here's something historians emphasise. Medieval caregivers often excelled at nursing. While theoretical medicine could misfire, bloodletting at the wrong time, purging an already weakened body, supportive care mattered. Hydration, warmth, rest. These are not dramatic interventions, but they can mean the difference between life and death in milder illnesses. You pause beside a patient with a fever. No one is reaching immediately for a blade. Instead, cloths are changed, water is offered, psalms are whispered, there's a quiet dignity in it. But then you see the tension again, the moment when someone worsens. A physician is summoned. He examines urine in a glass flask, tilting it toward the light. The colour suggests imbalance. Treatment is prescribed. Perhaps mild bloodletting. Perhaps a purge. The intention is correction. The result is not always improvement. Historians still debate how harmful medieval medicine truly was overall. Some argue that many treatments were relatively mild and that the body often recovered despite intervention, not because of it. Others point to cases where aggressive bleeding or purging likely hastened decline. It wasn't universal catastrophe, it was inconsistent risk. There's a strangely human detail you notice. Physicians often tailored advice to personality and status. A wealthy merchant might be told to moderate rich foods and wine. A labourer might be advised to avoid cold draughts and overexertion. Lifestyle counselling, primitive yes, was part of care. Not everything was leeches and lancets. In fact, sometimes the most dangerous aspect wasn't the treatment itself, but the delay caused by misdiagnosis. If illness was attributed to humoral imbalance rather than infection or injury severity, appropriate practical responses could be missed. A festering wound might be treated with poultices aligned to heat, rather than aggressively cleaned. A contagious disease might be blamed on bad air instead of close contact. Framework shapes response. And yet, here's the paradox. Medieval medicine laid essential groundwork for modern systems. Hospitals became permanent institutions. Medical licensing began to formalise. Universities standardised curricula. Record-keeping improved. You step outside into the courtyard. The bell tolls softly, not frantically, as during plague, but steadily. Life continues. A child recovers from a fever inside. An elderly man does not. Medicine here is not pure harm. It is not pure help. It is effort, bounded by the knowledge of its time. You realise something quietly profound. The medieval doctor would likely view modern medicine as equally strange. Invisible organisms, microscopic pathogens, surgery without pain, the circulation of blood as a closed loop. It would sound like alchemy in reverse. Certainty always feels contemporary.